Hey, welcome back everybody, and this is your third sample question on the topic of adopted children. Now, Kaia is the person in this scenario, and this question is going to test you on a different area again of adoption, and that is, of course, it's a little bit more future looking than the previous questions that we saw on this topic. But again, you're going to really learn a lot from this, and it's my pleasure to teach you and work with you today in helping you completely understand adopted children as it relates to your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So we have Kaia here. Kaia is from Vietnam and was adopted into a Canadian family when she was 15 years old because her parents broke up and her father could not support her financially. Her father agreed to allow a family friend who lives in Canada to legally adopt her because the family friend has two children the same age as Kaia and can easily afford to cover all of the expenses that may be incurred in supporting another child. As Vietnam is a signatory of the Geneva Convention, the adoption was fairly straightforward and there were no immigration issues with sponsoring Kaia as a member of the family class either. Now that Kaia is a professional accountant in Vancouver, she would like to sponsor her father, who has been living in Vietnam this whole time, for permanent resident status as a member of the family class, as she feels it is the right time for them to reconnect. Will Kaia's sponsorship of her father be successful? Now we have our potential answers. So we have A, yes. She does not have any other biological family members in Canada, so she can sponsor him. We have B, which says yes. She is now an adult and meets the requirements of being a sponsor. We have C, which says no, her father does not qualify to be sponsored. And finally, we have D, which says no, she does not meet the requirements to sponsor anybody. Okay, a pretty tricky little question here that touches upon another area of adopted family members. So this one's interesting because the previous examples that we saw dealt with either the sponsors or the children themselves or the international agreements. This one looks forward a bit more to see some of the ramifications of a person being adopted and their future lives when they attempt to adopt someone else. So some of these important pieces of information have to do with Kaia's age when she was adopted originally, and the reasons for this, as well whether or not the adoption was legal, which we can see that it was, whether or not there were immigration issues after the adoption itself, and they talk a little bit about her life now. So she's a professional accountant, so you might be thinking of the LICO and if she'd be able to meet it in order to sponsor her father, and of course the father. So when we take a look at this again as a whole, it's going to lead us towards the correct answer. So if you have the correct answer already, then that is really great news. We'll see how you came to this answer. Maybe you don't even know how you got to the correct answer, but hopefully you followed the procedure that we'll take a look at right now. So let's take a look at A to begin with. Now we're asking the question, of course, of whether or not Maya can sponsor her biological father. So as A, we have the option of yes, she can, because she doesn't have any other family members in Canada, biologically speaking. So this would touch upon the lonely family member a little bit but we have to look at this through the context of somebody who is adopted. So when you take a look again at Regulation 117.1h, which refers to the lonely family member, you could see it's what we talked about a couple of times already in these lessons, and where a person can sponsor a family member if that person doesn't have any Canadian family members already. However, Maya was adopted, so we could see from the scenario again that she was legally adopted, and that family friend has 2 children the same age as Kaia. So when we take a look again at adoptions, one of those main requirements of an adoption is that it creates a genuine parent-child relationship. And that relationship permanently severs the legal ties to the child's biological parents. You can also see this as having that relationship make legal ties between the child and the adoptive parents, so they would have, legally speaking, they would most likely have the same relationship as if it were her biological parents. So in terms of lonely family member sponsorship, she doesn't qualify to sponsor her father because those ties have been severed because of the adoption. All right, so we'll take a look at this again later on as we work through the question. Now we know that A is incorrect. So let's jump ahead now. We'll take a look at D because we're talking about her ability to sponsor someone. So we've touched upon this a little bit with A, but we'll fully explore this again by going through the other potential answers. So let's take a look at D here. So D says no, she cannot sponsor her biological father because she actually can't sponsor anybody as a family member. Now remember, even just if we look at the parent-grandparent sponsorship requirements, so we'll see that a person who wants to sponsor their parents or grandparents needs to be 18, Canadian citizen, PR. They have to actually sponsor the parent or grandparent, the undertaking, the agreement, which is what we saw before, and the LICO requirements. Now this is just an example, of course, with regard to parents and grandparents. If you've gone through the other lessons, we've talked about orphaned close family members, we've talked about last resort family class, we've talked about spouses, dependent children, and Kaia can sponsor other people, but the question that they're really asking here is whether or not she can sponsor her father. So as we saw before, when she was adopted, that severed those ties to her biological father. So she could sponsor someone, however, not her biological father. Now by answering A and D, this helped us to answer B automatically. So B says, yes, she is now an adult and she meets the requirements of being a sponsor. When we look at this, she meets the requirements of being a sponsor for some people, of course, but for her father, she does not, which is what we saw before. So by answering A and D, we already know that B is not the correct answer. So let's move on. We'll explore C as being the remaining answer. Now C says no, her father does not qualify to be sponsored, and if you answered this, this is 100% correct. So we saw this in the scenario right away, that she was legally adopted by a family in Canada. And as we saw as well, everything was straightforward, there were no immigration issues. When we take a look at Regulation 3 and that definition of adoption, this should again really cement this for you. So we could see that it severs that pre-existing legal relationship between the parent and child. And as we saw in the lesson, that means that the child can't sponsor the parents in the future, or the biological parents, I should say, in the future to come under the family class. So this leaves us with C as being the correct answer. Now, this question tested you on your knowledge of adoption, but of course it's very future looking. So whether or not a person who was adopted and gained their immigration status because of this adoption can sponsor their biological parents. That's one of those little tricky areas that might come up on the exam, but it's great that we talked about it, and hopefully you got this correct answer as well. Remember that essentially a person who's adopted can't sponsor their biological parents because legally their parents are the people who adopted them. All right, so thank you so much, and I'm really happy that we got to complete another piece of your immigration puzzle that's going to help you towards passing the full skills exam. Okay, so stay tuned. We have a lot more lessons for you to work through, and thank you so much for your time and your effort in becoming an RCIC.